Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tomcat Stitchery. I'm Whitney, and in today's video, I am showing you 3 alternative ways to gather. Now, the reason I'm saying alternative is that I'm not showing the most standard way of gathering, which is probably, if any of you have been sewing for a while, the method that you all learned, where it's, 2 parallel rows of long basting stitches that then you pull. I like to take a little turn on this, and you probably see me do this here on the channel a few times if you've watched any of my sew-alongs, but I do like to sew from one end down to the other, sew down, and then back with that long basting stitch in order to pull for my gathering stitches, just because that you're not accidentally pulling those threads out when you kind of do a 3-sided box, basically, with that. But I'm not going through that kind of method today because I get asked all the time, some of my tricks and ways that I speed things along, because I am a fast seamstress and I do have a few tricks and tips under my sleeve that I like to use for different techniques. And there are a few different ways that I also like to do alternative gathering. So I'm showing you 3 of those in today's video. So the first way that we are going to talk about is using a piece of floss is my preference, but you can use any kind of thread or yarn, anything along of that nature, but we are sewing it with a zigzag stitch to the top of our fabric that's going to be gathered, and it makes it really easy to gather that up. Especially if you're using dental floss, the wax on that just makes it really simple to gather that into shape. So let's go over to the ironing board and get started on this technique.
All right, so for this first tutorial, you're going to need your piece that you are gathering, obviously, which we have right here, an example, and dental floss. Now, I've seen people do this trick with other products as well, like yarn and that sort of thing, which you could absolutely try. The reason I love the dental floss is that it pulls out once you have secured your gathers and sewn. This pulls out really easy because of that wax coating. So completely up to you what you would like to use, but this is the 2 products. Any kind of string though will work. Just be maybe a little bit more work to pull it out once we are finished. So let's go to the sewing machine. We're actually going to be zigzagging this in along our seam allowance to then be able to gather. So let's go to the sewing machine and do that. Okay, so we're going to pretend that our seam allowance here is 1/2 inch. So I'm lining up my raw edge here at 3/8 of an inch because I want this to all happen within my seam allowance. And you can actually push this a little further out. It might make it a little bit easier. But I'm going to switch my machine from a straight stitch to a zigzag stitch. And I am going to use I think a 2.5 width. No, let's go to a 3. A 3 width, and then a 2 length. Maybe a 2.5 length. Okay, and our goal is to start sewing, and we do want to secure our floss here at the beginning, but our goal is to be zigzagging across on either side. So I'm actually going to plant my needle All right, so I'm planting my needle right inside the floss because I do want to make sure that it gets caught. I don't want to accidentally pull it out because then this will be for naught. So I am going to start and, okay. And then once we've get going, again, I'm going at 3/8 of an inch because I want this to be inside the seam allowance, and we're doing a pretend seam allowance here of but the idea is that we don't want to be sewing once we have started on our string or floss in this case. All right, so this is what we've got. So let's take it back over to the ironing surface and I'll show you what to do next. All right, so once we have got this all sewn, it's just a matter of now we're going to be pulling together, which we're just going to take our long edge. And this is very similar to like your typical, sew down, with a long basting stitch, pull it back up. So now we are just pulling that to create the gathers though, so that it fits into whatever flat edge that you're trying, or whatever piece that you are trying to gather this into. Very easy. And again, once you are finished and ready to pull this out, you just very easily clip, once you've sewn your seam to the flat, clip into that and it will pull right out because that wax coated floss works really well for that. So very easy way to do some gathering, really easy for small area, any kind of areas really. But a great alternative to doing the long basting stitches and pulling those up. This does pull up much easier and more fluid.
All right, a second way that is an easy one to gather, and this is really great for knits and wovens. Honestly, the other one is great for knits and wovens as well. And the third one. Any of these would work for knits and wovens. But this is really nice on knits specifically because you can leave this elastic treatment into, especially like a waistband, and it acts as a little bit as a stabilizer, a little bit as something that to help support the weight of any fabric you might be having hanging from a waistband, which is particularly helpful when it comes to knits because the knit fabric stretches. So if you have a lot of heavy weight of a skirt, it will make the bodice stretch because that is the nature of knit. And sometimes we don't want that. So the elastic really does help with that as well, just as a little side note. But for this tutorial, we're letting clear elastic do the gathering for us. As you can see, it does a really nice job of evenly gathering through the areas. Now, I do mention, that you may want to quarter your elastic and your long piece that's being gathered before starting this. It just makes it a little bit easier to stretch in between those quarter marks as opposed to trying to do the whole thing all at once and then hope that you're getting equal gathering along the whole edge of the skirt. So that is something to keep in mind. But this is a very easy way to gather in some fabric to then be sewn into the piece, the smaller piece that it's being sewn into. All right, let's go back over to the ironing board and take a look at this technique.
For this next example of how to gather, we're going to be using clear elastic. And I hope you guys can see that. Clear elastic is great. It's really thin, very stretchy, and we're going to be using it to do our gathering for us. Similar to the first one that we did with the zigzag stitch, except we're actually going to be stitching onto the elastic and letting the elastic do the gathering for us. So we've got our piece of fabric that we are gathering, and then we are going to cut our elastic to the length of the piece that we are gathering into. So the shorter of the two pieces, basically. So if that might be you're gathering a skirt into a bodice, you would cut your elastic the width of your bodice. Now, if you're working with really long piece of, for example, a waist measurement, if you're working with however many inches your waist has to be on your bodice, you may want to divide that into quarters. It makes it a lot easier to manage and to pull things as we go. So if that's the case, you're just going to fold, cut your piece the length that it needs to be, fold it in half, and mark that with either a pen or a marking pen as well, if that's your choice. And then you're going to fold your raw edges into that marked center edge, mark those in order to quarter that elastic. And then you're going to do the same thing to the piece that you are gathering. You're going to quarter that as well. It just makes it easier to be pulling your elastic between quarter marks as opposed to the whole thing. You just get a little bit more even gathering. So let's go to the machine and I will show you how to use elastic to gather your pieces. All right, so I have put my zigzag stitch on a 3 width and 3 length for this one. So we're going to start very similarly to how we did with our floss method, but I'm going to just bury my needle there we go. And again, we're pretending that these are a 1/2 inch seam allowances, so I'm sewing this at 3/8 of an inch. All right, and once we get going, now we are just literally, quite literally, stretching our elastic. So I am taking, zoom out so you can see, here's the end. I'm gonna take my ends and match them up. And then I'm just gonna start sewing. Now, once I get a little bit back behind here, it's best for you to just kind of stretch from both ends. It helps. All right. All right, and then when the elastic pulls up, it gathers it for you. This also works great to have that in a seam, especially if you're using a knit fabric, to work kind of as a extra stabilization as well. That can be really great. If it's not getting quite as small as you would like for it, take it over to your iron, give it a good steam, and it will shrink back up to its original length. Now you can sew this into your flat piece as well, and that should fit perfectly and have some really evenly spaced gathers. This is a really great option.
Okay, and for this final way of gathering, kind of an unconventional way of doing our gathering, this is probably my favorite when I'm doing tiered and gathered skirts, just because I find it the easiest. However, you do have to make sure that the piece you are gathering in is long enough, because it's really hard to gauge on a serger if it really is gathering in 2 to 1, even though our differential feed is saying that. So for this one, I'm actually showing it to you on the serger. I get so many questions about how I use my serger to do the gathering, but keep in mind that this can also work if you are using a ruffler foot on a sewing machine. I've just never sewn with a ruffler foot on a sewing machine before. I would love to have one, and that is on my wish list. But that is the technique that I'm showing you here for this one. So if you do have a serger and want to know how to use your differential feed to do some gathering, let's go over and I'll show you how to do that.
Okay, for this final demonstration of how you can gather, I'm actually going to be using a serger to do my gathering with a ruffler foot. You could also do something very similar with a ruffler foot on your sewing machine. I've not used a ruffler foot on my sewing machine. I would love to. That's probably on a list of things that I would like to purchase. But my serger does it really well, and it's very easy to do with a ruffler foot on a serger. So I'm going to show you how to do that in this final example. So you're going to need your long piece that you're gathering, and then your shorter piece that you're gathering in too. So this shorter piece is the piece that we want to be flat, and this bottom longer piece is the piece that's going to be gathered into the shorter piece. Now, with this method, because we are using the differential feed on the serger to do our gathering, even though I might know that my skirt of my dress is 2 times wider than the bodice, so it's a 2 to 1 thing, depending on your fabric, sometimes even though we put the differential feed on 2 to 1, it doesn't feed it through maybe as tightly as it needs to, or maybe too tight, so you end up with shorter pieces. So my recommendation, if you're using this method, is to always cut your rectangles or whatever that you're gathering longer than you need. So this doesn't work for every application, because sometimes you need a specific shape of a pattern piece, then you'll want to use one of the other 2 methods. But for this one, if I'm just dealing with rectangles, I'll just cut that rectangle much longer than I think I need, and then once it's been gathered into the piece above it, then I will go back and trim off the extra of that longer piece, if that makes sense. All right, let's go to the serger and I'll show you how this is done. Okay, so my serger is a Baby Lock Evolution, although I think a lot of these feet look the same. This is foot G, which is the ruffler foot for the Baby Lock machines. You'll see that it has like a little area here where we can push fabric. This is where the flat fabric is going to go, in between these 2. And then our fabric we're gathering is going to go underneath the foot here, so that the feed dogs can do all of the gathering for us. But again, this is called a ruffler foot, and it is foot G for the Baby Lock Evolution. Probably most Baby Locks. So first we're going to put that on. I have a 4 thread going on here. I don't have to change my tensions at all, but over here, this is where my differential feed is here on the baby lock. Most of the time you want to set it in. So this is depending on how, or this is telling the machine how quickly to make those feed dogs work. You know, if you're working with a stretch fabric, it works out really, really great for stuff like that. What we're going to do is we go all the way up to a 2 here. That is the very top, which means it is going to be going at twice the rate as what the fabric above would be feeding through, so a 2 to 1. So I'm just going to take this knob and go all the way up to that 2. Okay, so now we are going to take the fabric that we are gathering, and we're going to slide it under here, and I'm running it 3/8 of an inch, so I'm running it right along the edge there. It will get cut by the knife, but that's what I want. And I like, again, this is another reason why I like to have a little bit of extra that I'm working with, because I can get this started just a little bit. Just get it underneath those feed dogs. Then I'm going to take the shorter piece that I want to stay flat, and it's going to go in between these layers. And sometimes I have to lift the presser foot to get it in there, but I can see that it's lining up with that knife there too. So we're just going to go slow here for just a minute. Now my job is to make sure, there we go, that everything is staying to the far right so that I'm catching everything. So as you can see, even though this was a 2 to 1, and my longer fabric was twice as long as my top fabric, it didn't feed it in quite as thick, just because of the nature of this fabric. So I've got a little bit of extra. Not a big deal. I can just trim that off. You just don't want the opposite to happen, to where you run out of the bottom before you're all the way around the top. But then that has created these really beautiful gathers here. So let's go back to the board and take one last quick look. So there you've got some beautiful gathers, and it's just gathered right into the flat piece above. This works great for wovens as well as for knits. You know, it kind of sews, especially the 4 thread, it sews as well as finishes that off. I usually, if I am doing, I love this method for tiered and gathered dresses, because it's just long rectangles that you're working with. So you can make them as long as you need to then sew them into the tier above, and I often will go and top stitch that down too, just to make sure that that seam is nice and fixed, because I don't want anything, you know, to come out, because it's just a serger and I haven't used a sewing machine. But this works, again, really great with wovens and with knits. So there are 3 alternative ways to do your gathering. Yeah, it's very in right now. You see lots of tiers, so I hope you give one of these a try and let me know how it goes below.
And there you have it. 3 alternative ways to do some gathering. I'm seeing gathering everywhere, whether it's a puff sleeve you're working with, a tiered and gathered skirt of some sort, adding a ruffle on to some part of a garment. These are all really great tips and tricks to help you go a little bit faster. I think gathering is probably my least favorite of all the sewing techniques to do. So any way I can make that a little less painful is always a plus. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this video today. As always, leave any questions you have down below. I'm happy to answer those. And until next time, happy sewing. Bye.